symbolizes what I mean by using big data, and the other is based on data from a large social media platform, Weibo. And both projects could showcase the range and the types of big data we collect and analyze. Last but not the least, I want to share some observations with you about where we are as a field, the trends and challenges I have observed, and where we are going in the next 5 years. So I know it's really, really difficult to make predictions, but today, in the maybe last 15 minutes, I'm gonna try to make those predictions, and I'll be very eager to hear your feedback on that as well. As the host kindly mentioned, I am at UC Davis. At UC Davis, I'm the co-director of a lab called Computational Communication Research Lab, or SICSS-SG lab for short. Since 2014, we have built one of the largest computational research clusters in communication in the United States, even though our department is fairly small. So the cluster currently has 6 faculty from communication, and many graduate students and faculty affiliates from all across campus. So we're really proud of that. And I have been intimately involved in the development of computational communication as a rapidly growing subfield in communication. And today I'll talk about some of my observations with that experience. And I served as vice chair and chair of the Computational Methods Division of ICA. And I'm also the founding associate editor of the journal Computational Communication Research, CCR, since 2017. CCR is an open access journal and is the official journal of Computational Methods Division of ICA. And I highly recommend, if you have computational methods oriented articles, this will be a very much viable and a very visible outlet for your scholarship. I also serve as an associate editor of JCMC, where I handle most of the computational manuscripts. So if you submit to JCMC and it's very kind of computationally oriented, chances are I will be the associate editor to handle your manuscript. So with that, I want to offer a very kind of bird's eye overview of computational social science, or computational communication as a subset of computational social science. I realized that yesterday, Suboyang had a keynote, which offers an overview of computational communication, or computational social science. So this might feel a little bit redundant, but I just want to make sure to kind of set the scene here. I will make this really quick. So I would assume most of you are aware of this article, Computational Social Science. I think this was published in the journal Science, I think around 2009. And many people think of the publication of this article as sort of an official moment, an emergence of this new field in social science. And in this article, they offered a definition of CSS. It leverages the capacity to collect and analyze data at a scale that may reveal patterns of individual and group behaviors. Okay, as you can see, the definition of CSS is inextricably linked with big data. Okay, so, and I think this scene will appear again later in the talk. Now, and the emergence of CSS came at a pivotal point. So this is an article published by Hilbert and Lopez. One of them is actually in UC Davis. Also, this article was published in Science. So the amount of information in the world has been rapidly increasing, and more of that information is stored digitally, which facilitates analysis, transmission, and merging. And all of this digital information has come to be called big data. In addition to this explosion of digital data, there is a parallel growth, on the right-hand side, in access to computing power. And these trends, increasing amounts of digital data and increasing availability of computing, are likely to continue for the foreseeable future, right? So as we can see, this is a kind of a perfect storm in the brewing, right? We have more data, and we also have more computing power, and combining forces, this is the kind of watershed moment for, big data analysis, or big data as part of computational social science. And what does this mean for social science? And let me offer you a similar case. About 30 years ago, in 1990, NASA's Hubble Space Telescope was launched into the low Earth orbit. And then Hubble can take extremely high resolution images. It has recorded some of the most detailed visible light images ever, allowing a deep view into space and time. In other words, big data collected by Hubble have led to breakthroughs in astrophysics. And social sciences, in my view, is at our own Hubble moment, right? The revolutions brought by big data and computing power is going to create breakthroughs in social science as well. Okay, so I think for every one of you in this room, myself included, we are lucky to be at the right moment. Okay, we don't actually encounter these moments very often throughout our career. And this is a moment to make big discoveries. And I think since this is, not towards just people in communication, but in social sciences in general, I want to briefly talk about the difference between computer science and social science. And it's important to make sure we're on the same page about the definition of CSS. So many understand CSS as a fruitful marriage, if you will, or intersection of computer science methods and social sciences. And computer science methods include agent-based modeling, network analysis, text mining, machine learning, visual analysis, etc. And then in social science, we have different disciplines, right? And these disciplines are organized around specific topics or dependent variables they're interested in. So for example, communication is about human communication phenomena, right? Sociology, they're interested in a set of different questions, psychology as well. And with this in mind, CSS is fundamentally social science. Okay, I want to make this really clear. CSS is fundamentally social science. It is not computer science. And computer science supplies us with the methods or the approach, but CSS is fundamentally investigating social science problems. Or in other words, CSS is in pursuit of understanding human behavior. Okay, and I think to some extent, some computer scientists do that as well. But if you read computer science scholarship and social science or computational social science scholarship a lot, you'll note that there are notable differences. Our goals are different, and it's really important to be clear that CSS is fundamentally social science, not computer science, because our goals are to understand human behavior, not to develop computer science tools. Okay, so the common understanding is that a lot of our lives are conducted online, and most digital traces of human activities are communicative in nature. So in this paper that I wrote together with some of the co-editors of Computational Communication Research, the Open Access Journal, a roadmap for computational communication research, we tried to give a definition or a boundary of what computational communication is. And we feel that computational communication is really at the center of CSS, right? Because most digital traces of human activities are communicative in nature. Okay. So we think computational communication is an emergent subfield that leverages computational tools to gather, analyze, and make sense of big data sets to understand human communication phenomena. Okay, so here I highlight the word big data. And if you remember in the 2009 Science article, which give a definition of computational social science, it also mentions big data as a very, very crucial or even defining element of CSS. Okay. However, I would want to mention that there is a notable exception to this. So I would say most of the CSS or computational communication scholarship I've seen are, somewhat related or connected with, approaches, or, or they're collecting or measuring or using big data in some way. But it would be wrong to say that all CSS scholarship is connected to big data. There are papers that are not using big data, but we would think of them as CSS as well. And that's one notable exception. And that will be agent-based models. So in that regard, I would say most of the scholarship in CSS or computational methods are about big data, but there is one notable exception, and that's agent-based modeling, which we won't have time to cover. But I just want to make sure that I'm not trying to lump everything together, say computational equals big data. It is not. Okay, so I will be focusing my talk on big data because that's what I do. And I want to highlight two characteristics of big data. Perhaps this already been mentioned yesterday in Subhan's keynote, but I think it's probably worth repeating here briefly. So big data are observational data, which means we are observing a social system without intervening in any way. And big data are created and collected for purposes other than research, and using this data for research, therefore, requires repurposing. Okay. Now, by contrast, as social scientists, before we engage with big data, we are very familiar with other very smaller forms of data, such as surveys, right? Such as experiments. Now, smaller data collected from surveys and experiments that we typically work with, they are collected by intervening the social system in some way, right? If you think about it, surveys, you have to ask people to fill your surveys. In doing so, you're intervening, you're interacting with the social system, okay? Experiments, even more so. All experiments involve some kind of manipulation, okay? And that is intervention in some way. By contrast, big data are observational data, okay? So we are observing, but we're not interacting with the social system in any way. So I highly recommend a textbook on computational social science, and this textbook is Bit by Bit. In Bit by Bit, the author Sauganek offers a really nice metaphor that I'm going to present here. So I think it will be really useful to understand how big data is different from conventional empirical data through this art analogy presented in the Bit by Bit book. So on the left, we see the French artist Duchamp's famous modern art fountain. Duchamp is best known for ready-mades, such as fountain, where he took ordinary objects, such as a urinal in this case, and repurposed them as art. Michelangelo, on the other hand, he didn't repurpose. When he wanted to create a statue of David, he didn't look for a piece of marble that already looked like David. He spent 3 years laboring to create this masterpiece. So David is not a ready-made, it is a custom-made. And I think this is a striking art analogy, really illustrates the difference between ready-made and custom-made. They roughly map onto styles that can be employed for social research in the digital age. We are very familiar with custom-made. Basically, this was how I was trained, right? It's how empirical data were always collected from surveys, experiments, and qualitative interviews, what have you. And we have the research questions first, then we create that data needed to answer these questions. Well, big data, they were already created by companies, by governments, by social media platforms, and we have to access them and repurpose them to answer our questions. Okay, next, in very broad strokes, I am going to present to you my categorization of big data. So I divide big data, specifically those used in communication research, into two categories, okay? And they each have very different traits and research implications. So I divide them first into content data and footprints data. Okay, so let's take a look at content data first. Now, content, they could take the form of text content, such as a tweet from Donald Trump, right? Or they could take the form of a news report, okay? Something that we are very familiar with. You know, this is an example of a news report from the New York Times. They could also take multimodal format, such as audio, images, videos, etc. We are all very familiar with those. We encounter content every day. Now, content are typically unstructured, okay? So unstructured, I mean, you know, you encounter a piece of content here, you have a piece of content there, you can get tweets, you can get images, you can get news reports, but inherently, they don't offer much structure. They may offer a little bit of structure. For example, I don't know how many of you have had experience collecting news reports, for example. The data will have some structure to work with. For example, you know, it may tell you the title, the author, where this news report is from, right? Okay, it may tell you maybe there is image included, maybe there is audio, and then there is text, which is unstructured, okay? So a little bit of metadata, but overall, it is unstructured. Another characteristic of content data is that they're easy to get. Okay, so you know, when I teach graduate seminars on social media or computational research, you know, typically when students think about where to get data, they would think about, oh, news reports. Oh, I can get Twitter data. Oh, I can get Instagram. I can get Facebook through CloudTangle, etc. Right? So they are easy to get. Maybe easy, you know, maybe I should backtrack. They are easier to get than some other type of data, which I'll talk about in a second. But actually, they're not easy as like really easy, because as we know, like Twitter is changing permanently, Reddit is changing permanently. So maybe it used to be easy. Now it is not as easy, but compared to footprint data, content is still easier to get. Okay, what are some other characteristics of content? Okay, so this one's important. I think an important feature of content data is that it is long and narrow, okay? I talk about long and narrow because I think about the data table in my mind, right? So data table, you have the rows and you have the columns, okay? So the rows represent the number of cases, right? So in statistical language, it's sample size, or N, the big N. So what I mean by long is that there is a large sample size typically, okay? And it can be huge, okay? It could go all the way up to millions or sometimes tens of millions. But narrow means the number of variables, the number of columns is often very, very small, okay? So it has a long structure, very large N, large sample size, but the number of variables can be very small, okay? So here I'm showing you an example. This is a search output from a website called Media Cloud. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. It is a big data source of news media reports. Okay, so if you conduct research in news, in digital journalism, you know, or using this as a kind of validation source, you probably heard of that. So what you can do is that you can search for a keyword in Media Cloud. It will return a list of news reports from various news outlets from all over the world. You know, it gives you some metadata, where this is from, what's the title, etc. What you can see is that there are lots of rows, but there are only a few columns. Okay, so in other words, the number of columns is much, 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 much smaller than the number of rows. Here's another example. This is a Twitter table, data table, very typical. Again, you see lots of rows, but very, very few columns. Now, even though this is still considered big data, right? And what is really big about it is the sample size. Okay, the N is really big, but not anything else. The number of variables here is not big at all. In fact, it's actually smaller than a lot of surveys and experiments. So with this long and narrow structure, this type of data does not offer many possibilities for rich inferential analysis on its own. Okay, so I don't want to say that I'm dissing this kind of long and narrow content data, because this is, actually most of the paper is built on. So as editor, I've seen so many computational manuscripts are using content data. There's nothing wrong with it. But what I'm saying that on its own, this type of data does not offer many possibilities for rich inferential analysis, but it could be used in conjunction with other data sources, so that while the N is very big, we should find ways to make the columns, more dimensional as well. Now, this type of data is usually used for content analysis, usually, not always. To make sense of the message itself. And with this very large sample size, we could leverage automated content analysis and text mining tools. And I'm sure during SICSS, you'll have plenty of opportunities to try out these automated content analysis and text mining tools. For example, there are automatic text mining tools such as LDA or topic modeling, which gives you a sense of how these the content can be meaningfully clustered, for example. And semantic network will be another approach. So there are lots of text analysis tools available, and I think their purpose is to conduct automated content analysis. Okay. So that is content data. The second big category of big data is footprint data. So footprint data represent the many human activities happening online, offline, in the metaverse, what have you. And they include different kinds of activities such as search, browse, follow, shop, organize, like, comment, share, right? Those are used very, very often. And people collaborate, create stuff, play, live stream, track. So there are lots and lots of activities happening online. Footprint data compared with content data, they are harder to get, okay? Because content is easier, kind of lower hanging fruit, but footprint data is harder to get. And contrary to the long and narrow structure of content data, I think footprint data, they're typically long and also wide. So I think this is a distinct advantage of footprint data over content data, because they are wider, which means they have more variables, they have more columns. So this is an example. This is a glimpse of the data structure of a past project I was involved with. I collaborated with the operator of a massively multiplayer online game called EverQuest. This is actually my dissertation. As you can see, this footprint data included more than 24 data tables with hundreds of variables at different levels of analysis. Some of these variables are static, but most are dynamic at millisecond level. With this long and wide data set, we were able to reconstruct all aspects of human activities in this virtual world, including their economic transactions, their achievements through battles, their organizational structures, friendships, their movements within the virtual world, their communication with each other, etc. And so footprint data is usually structured like this, okay? And their structures can be complex, and they can be stored in relational databases. And then footprint data, their richness and complexity lend themselves naturally to more inferential analysis about human communication phenomena. Okay, so that is footprint data. All right, so I briefly discussed the two big categories of big data. One is content, the other is footprint. So where are we now? In my role as the past chair of Computational Methods Division, and my current editorial roles at the two journals, CCR and JCMC, I think I have reviewed and programmed up to 1,000 manuscripts in computational communication in the past 5 years. So I did observe some trends and patterns. The trend I've observed is that the kind of data getting used in computational studies, they're not evenly distributed at all. So most big data studies are based on content rather than footprint. Okay, so much more focused on content rather than footprint. The second pattern is that among those using content data, most are studying text data rather than multimodal data such as images, podcasts, videos. And more studies are doing descriptive analysis than inferential analysis. So that has been my observation. In other words, I think we're not using the full spectrum of big data. And our efforts so far have been concentrated in a very, very small subset of all the available big data available to us. That means we're far from realizing the huge potential of big data to advance communication as a field. And we'll come back to this slide later in this talk about the cause of this uneven distribution and where I think we are going from here. Okay, so that has been an overview as the past chair and as current editors. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about some of my own key research areas. I study behaviors in online networks, including the structure, evolution, and impact of social networks in various virtual worlds and online platforms. Another kind of current interest of mine is to look at multimodal misinformation. Misinformation in the form of images, memes, videos, etc., and the interventions and correction efforts. And the third line is methodological advances, how to collect and analyze big data, including both content and footprints, together with smaller data. So I'm a very big proponent of combining the ready-mades, remember the Duchamp's fountain, and custom-mades such as Michelangelo's David. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so next, I want to talk about two current research projects, which I think kind of, be examples of using footprint data and content data respectively. So the first study I want to talk about is titled Viral Vitriol, Predictors and Contagion of Online Toxicity in a World of Tanks. This was published in the journal Computers and Human Behavior in 2020. And this one is focused on online toxicity because we think it's on the rise in online worlds. It has huge implications for online culture. It is very prevalent in online discussion, from YouTube comments to Reddit to Facebook groups, etc. And in discussion forums, they mostly take the form of verbal aggression. But toxicity is also found in different kinds of online games, ranging from social games to massively multiplayer online games. In such games, they may also take the form of cyberbullying, trolling, griefing, harassment, in addition to verbal aggression. And we all know that toxicity has a lot of negative implications. It reduces enjoyment, it fractures the community. And the question is, why do people engage in such behaviors? And what causes gamers to behave toxically? And we think knowing why could not only help us understand the cause, but also help us prevent it or mitigate toxicity. So there have been some studies examining toxicity, but most are based on textual or verbal data scraped from online forums, or they're based on survey questions, which they're useful, but they're unsatisfying to present a more kind of representative picture. they are also tend to be descriptive in nature. Another thing is that existing studies focus mostly on individual factors rather than situational factors. So in other words, they want to look for the bad apples. But I'm not a believer in bad apples. I think we need to recognize the possibility that some bad apples are not born as bad apples, but they're made. So I think, situational factors can play a very important role in, making otherwise non-toxic people into, toxic players. There's some of the common mechanisms leading to toxic behaviors, and we tested those in this study. First, computer-mediated environment, people are anonymous or invisible, and research has shown that anonymity will be associated with a tendency for people to be less inhibited. At the group level, people in invisible online environments, they are particularly influenced by cues related to group membership. And individuals are more likely to operate at the level of social identity rather than their personal identity. They're more likely to conform to group social norms, even if the norms are antisocial. So contagion or socialization processes refer to the process within which individuals can learn what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. People may learn that within their group, toxic behaviors are okay without consequences. Alternatively, negative emotions can also trigger similar negative emotions in other people, which could explain the contagion of toxic behaviors. So in order to test these mechanisms, we find a very nice environment. And therefore, the study is situated in a large-scale game called World of Tanks. And individual players, they can drive a tank in the first-person environment similar to a shooter game. And the gameplay mainly revolves around matches between two teams. So if you win, you level up, you can upgrade to better and more powerful tanks. There are two ways to organize these matches between teams. You could join a random game. In random games, players are automatically assigned into the teams with strangers. They don't have prior interactions and they do not expect future interactions after the game. Or a lot of players would join a clan, which is a kind of semi-permanent player organization. Within these clans, teams can be formed and you play against other teams. And there are more communication tools, such as in-game chat or voice systems available to the players. And these are more likely to be used in clan battles with people than in random battles with strangers. So this game setting provides a really nice organizational environment to examine how toxicity comes into being. We obtained longitudinal footprint data by collaborating with the game's publisher, Wargaming. The data were from the game servers in North and South America from 1 month in 2018, and the behavioral data included two components. The first component contained time-stamped information on the more than 1.4 million battles during this 31-day period. It included the type of the battle, the length of the battle, the result of the battle, the members of both teams, the skill level of each member, and the type of level of tanks used in the battle. Basically everything, right? So we kind of have the God's perspective. We obtain everything. The second component recorded timestamp information on a player-reported toxicity incidents. So the game has a toxicity reporting system. Okay, so as a player, I could report someone, say, this person was toxic. So, and the system captures my ID, the ID of the reporter, and also the accused perpetrator, the type of the toxicity incident, the ID of the team, and the battle where that toxic behavior took place. So toxicity in World of Tanks can be reported by players during the battle or after the battle. And the game designed 4 categories of toxicity. One is unsportsmanlike conduct, inaction or bots, inappropriate behavior, and offensive nickname. Okay, so those are instituted by the game itself. And that was interpreted by the players themselves. Okay, And being reported as toxic is really quite serious. It carries a cost to the offender, as 5 reports will result in a suspension of the account. So 5 strikes, okay? Now, can I just go there and report everybody? No, because it's also costly for me, the reporter, if I misreport someone as toxic when in fact they were not. Okay, so it carries a cost for misreporting for the reporter as well, as there are mechanisms for players to appeal those decisions. Okay, so it is quite serious, and there are mechanisms to safeguard the credibility of these reports. Okay, in other words, this toxicity data is quite reliable. Other than toxicity, we calculated variables players' skill. So World of Tanks, they utilize a specific algorithm to measure player skill called player rating. And then we also calculated the team skill advantage, which is one team's skill differential over their opponent team. And then another thing we calculated is team skill disparity. That measures, within a single team, how unevenly distributed are the skill levels of the members of the team. Okay, and we use a standard deviation to capture that. So it refers to the uneven distribution of player skills within the team, which might indicate a problem for team coordination if the disparity is high. And then every player's exposure to toxic behavior is measured by the number of reported toxic instances during each battle. And we further divided such exposure into toxicity exposure within one's own team and the enemy team, as well as toxicity exposure in clan battles versus random battles. And then, of course, we controlled a bunch of stuff, battle time, experience, etc. Okay. First big finding is that veteran gamers who are more experienced, more skilled, they spend more time in clans, they are more likely to be offenders. Okay, and I don't think anyone is surprised by that finding, because past cyberbullying research generally points to a status or rank differential between the perpetrator and the victim. Okay. And then highly experienced players, they're often impatient towards newbies, right? And then we also think there might be a hidden contagion process. The more people played, the more likely they are to be exposed to toxic behavior. Therefore, they may adopt that behavior, okay? So therefore, I think we could be seeing a trial by fire process where the newbies who did not want to kind of stick it out in a toxic environment, they would eventually leave the game. Okay, so they self-select out. And those who stayed, they toughened up over time. They get more used to the toxic culture. And as they level up, they start to become offenders themselves. Okay, so it is a self-selection and a socialization, kind of social learning process combined into one. We also did a bunch of models looking at team level factors, and team level factors did contribute to toxicity as well. Basically, the finding is that context matters beyond individual characteristics. When one's own team is losing, which is measured by an average skill disadvantage to the opponent team, toxicity is more likely. And a gamer is likely to experience negative affects such as frustration and anger, which could lead to hostile and toxic behaviors. On the contrary, when my team is winning, I'm likely to experience positive affect, right? So I'm happy, I'm smug. So toxicity is in turn less likely to occur in such a situation. When the skill within my team is unevenly distributed, so there are people very good, there are also people really bad, coordination failures would occur and conflicts would occur, and both would increase the level of stress and frustration, evoking more toxicity, right? And this is not surprising at all. So our finding also show that gamers are more toxic in random battles, because when there is little anticipation of future interactions, behaving badly has minimal social costs, right? So why not? Here we also use event history analysis to estimate the effects of various factors on the spread of toxic behaviors within the game. Here, the outcome variables is the likelihood of the occurrence of a player becoming toxic in the future. And the data set was aggregated at the player and at the day level. Okay. We found that exposure to toxicity is associated with becoming toxic oneself. Okay, so with that event history analysis, we did find evidence that, as I'm exposed to, other people behaving badly, I tend to behave badly over time. Okay, I think this may partially explain our earlier finding that veteran players are also more likely to be toxic, because observing toxic behavior is likely to create a sense of social proof. This is normal, bad behavior is normal, so I should do it as well. We found that toxicity was more contagious in clan battles in comparison to random battles, even though toxicity was much more less likely to happen in clan battles and random battles. In other words, friends are much more civil when they're playing with each other, but when toxicity does occur, it can set up a firestorm. And this could be due to social learning, in which friends are much more influential than strangers. And if you see your friends doing bad stuff, you're more likely to copy those bad behaviors too. So therefore, our contributions. We recognize that antisocial behaviors are not solely determined by individual characteristics. Rather, individuals become toxic as a result of situational factors such as team dynamics and their exposure to other toxic behaviors. And toxicity is more likely to occur in teams under stress, and it's contagious. And these results also suggest ways to minimize toxicity. We can reduce player stress and frustration by improved battle matching algorithms. We can build AI to detect toxicity early and prevent it from escalating, right? For example, set up a messaging limit or freezing the account temporarily. So this concludes the toxicity study. The second study I want to briefly talk about uses content data instead of footprint data. So this was published also in 2020 at the Journal of Medical Internet Research. To provide some context, I want to take you down the memory lane to early 2020 just for a brief moment, which kind of feels like a decade ago, right? Early 2020. At that time, COVID-19 outbreak just started. Wuhan, the epicenter, had locked down. There's lots of confusion, lots of chaos. But most of all, as reported here in this news report, the PCR test to find COVID, they were very, very hard to come by because of limited capacity, and lots of people with symptoms could not get a quick diagnosis. Therefore, the number of officially confirmed cases were believed to be a gross underestimation of reality. And this created a series of problems in delivering effective public health response. And as COVID was spread to other parts of the world, including Singapore, including the United States, the same exact problem of testing delay and testing shortage would happen again and again. So at that time, this got me thinking, in the situation of testing shortage, are there ways to utilize big data for COVID surveillance as a supplement to conventional surveillance methods? This is actually not a new idea. So to use social media in public health surveillance, actually, there was quite some success in, I think, 2008, 2009, when a group of scientists used Google search trends for flu surveillance, so-called Google flu trends. If you guys are going to read up on the bit by bit book, this was actually mentioned a couple of times. This was a very, very prominent case of early computational social science studies. The Google flu trends will appear again and again. So the mechanism at that time was very simple, right? If more people they're getting flu, they will more likely to search for flu. Flu-related symptoms, flu-related information on Google. Therefore, we should only be monitoring the Google search trends about flu, and then we'll get an idea about the flu epidemic. And this was regarded as one of the best examples of big data applications in public health. However, the success of Google Food Trends quickly faded, and Google Food Trends lost its predictive power after just a few years. And the big question is why? Okay. Why did it work in the first place? And why did it not work just a few years later, right? This is a very kind of prominent case study of CSS, the perils and promises of CSS. Now, many people believe that the aggregated search trends are too noisy to be useful for surveillance, right? Because there are many reasons people will search for something. Not all of them are about having the illness themselves. For example, there could be media reports and increased public attention on something, so people search more of that, but that doesn't mean there is an outbreak. Okay, so I'm sure, like let's say monkeypox or Ebola or something like that, right? Because media reported on these things and people would search, that doesn't necessarily mean that people who search are monkeypox or Ebola patients. Okay, so it's really noisy when we use aggregated search trends. So in this study, we used Weibo. We're trying to do the same thing, but we are trying to improve upon and to learn from the mistakes of Google search trends. Okay, and we used Weibo, which is a Twitter-like platform, and very, very popular in mainland China. In a nutshell, this study involves the largest and most comprehensive, most granular collection of social media data related to COVID in the Chinese language at that time, and far exceeding the scale, granularity, and time span of similar studies. The only thing I want to mention here is that what we're trying to do that I think is kind of a true contribution in social media and public health surveillance is that we try to reduce the noise by looking for sick posts only. Okay, so this is something I've highlighted here in our workflow of getting the Weibo data ready to be put in our predictive models. So we started with the entire Weibo population, just snowball sampling, and we had a user poll. And then we collected data between 1st of November in 2019 towards the end of March in 2020. We get lots of posts. And then we did keyword search, and those keywords are related to COVID-19. I mean, a lot of researchers do that. However, after doing that, we think that the posts with true predictive power would be posts that are reporting symptoms or confirmed cases, okay? Not anything else, not about commenting on COVID-19 related news reports, for example. Okay, so after we got COVID-related posts, we did a machine learning classification of what we call sick posts and non-sick posts. Okay, so sick posts are those Weibo posts that specifically reported on COVID symptoms or COVID diagnoses, but not anything else. Okay. Anything else that's not related to reporting of COVID symptoms, we lump them into other COVID posts. So with that, we plotted the Weibo posts and COVID cases on the same timeline. This is actually the fastest research project I had ever participated in. So our first project meeting was around the start of February in 2020, and in about less than 2 months' time, we already had our first draft. We used vector autoregression models to analyze the data. Basically, it's a kind of a time series analysis to predict. It's a time series analysis to predict COVID cases based on the sick post count several days prior. The blue bars on the left represent the predictive power of sick posts on COVID confirmed cases up to 20 days later, and the orange bars represent the predictive power of other COVID-related posts on COVID cases up to 20 days later. As you can see, the blue bars consistently outperforming the orange bars in terms of their predictive power. And this same pattern holds true for geotag posts within Hubei, which is the epicenter, and outside of Hubei. So our main contribution here is that not all social media data on a certain topic are equally useful. Social media chatter of symptoms and diagnoses rather than general mentions are useful for public health surveillance. Okay, so that's it. That's our main finding. Okay, so I have talked about the two studies to showcase footprint data and content data. And next 10-15 minutes, I want to talk about future directions of computational communication research. So this slide, I've shown it earlier. So coming back to this, this is about where we are as a field. Now, it's very clear that we're not using the full spectrum of big data, right? We're not using much footprint data. And among the content data, we are actually not using much multimodal data either. And this obsession with text and text mining, I think, is really not because communication scholars have a particular interest in text above anything else. It's not because text is better than anything else. From my perspective, this is a result of the easy accessibility of off-the-shelf text mining tools. So text data and text analysis have conveniently become an on-ramp for computational communication scholars, which is great. But I think this is about to change. Thanks to more tools and availability to analyze footprint data and multimodal data, I think our field is on the cusp of explosive growth to leverage the full spectrum of big data to understand human communication. Today, a big data study that is purely based on text and descriptive text analysis is very, very unlikely to get accepted to some of the best journals in our field, right? And this is a good thing because it reflects the maturing of our subfield, because the bar is now much higher. And as researchers, we can and we should do better than this. Again, I'm not advocating saying that content data is not good, text analysis is bad. I mean, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that in the past, maybe stuff on the left side could get you into a good journal, but now the bar is much higher, and doing stuff on the left is not enough. And I firmly believe that this is a great thing. This is a really, really good thing. And it presents us lots and lots and lots of opportunities to do better research. So where are we going? And I'm going to offer 3 future research directions. The first direction, I think we are seeing the shift from text data to multimodal content data. Okay. And in order to make my argument, I'm going to present you some math I did on the back of a napkin. Okay, I found recent statistics about some of the biggest social media platforms in the world, just to give an estimate of the volume of text data relative to multimodal content. And I'm going to take Twitter and Instagram and YouTube as examples of text data, image data, and video data. And I'm going to use the most conservative estimates to calculate the information volume generated on these platforms. So every tweet is 140 characters in the past, right? Even though now there could be longer tweets, let's just say 140 characters. So that comes about at 50 megabytes per minute, okay? And for Instagram, if we assume people use the oldest iPhone on the market, that translates to roughly 2 megabytes per photo, and this means 130,000 megabytes per minute image data being generated on Instagram. And for YouTube, every minute is about 20 megabytes for standard high definition video. So that translates into 600,000 megabytes per minute. So what do these numbers mean? In other words, if we can use social media data as a rough representation of all the content data available, the information generated by tweets from Twitter is equivalent of less than 0.006% of all the data generated by images and videos on Instagram and YouTube at every minute. So compared to multimodal data, text data is literally a drop in the bucket. Text is really important, I agree, but it's a very, very tiny component of the content data we have. I think it is time for communication scholars to start also looking at the other 99.9% of content data, either independently or in conjunction with text analysis. So that's the first future direction from text to multimodal. The second future direction is the shift from using big data alone to combining big data with other sources of data. Okay, so here again, using the same art analogy, we should combine the ready-mades and the custom-mades. Ready-mades or observational data, they're collected without our intervention with the social system in any way. That doesn't mean the ready-mades are without biases. Big data also have biases. They just have different biases than those of custom-made data, such as surveys and experiments. Now, as researchers, we should not have to choose either or, okay? Instead, I think the most synergy will be achieved if we could combine ready-mades and custom-mades in our research. But how to do this? Okay, let me offer a few examples. So I have published extensively based on my collaboration with game companies. So to not only access their big data, but also to work with them to field surveys to their users directly, to collect self-reports. Okay, so sometimes this combination can work without directly collaborating with these companies. I know developing or cultivating a collaborative relationship with big companies can be really difficult and a daunting task, especially for early career researchers. But it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes we can combine big data and survey without talking to these companies. So in my recent work on Twitch.tv, we collected big data via Twitch's API. We also managed to collect survey data and link those with the big data. So it is definitely doable. So here's two examples. The big data is from World of Tanks, and then it was combined with surveys, I think in both studies on gender differences. Right, so both of these articles are a result of collaboration with wargaming. One with big data only, the other with surveys. And the one on the right-hand side, Trojan player typology, this is from an earlier project where we collaborated with Sony as well as Kingsoft, which is a Chinese game company. And we not only had their big data, but also field surveys in both games. And in the end, we were able to develop a motivation scale that is cross-genre and cross-cultural and behaviorally validated. So this sure beats a big data only study or a survey only study. That's why I think a combination of ready-made and custom-made can create the most synergy. Here are two more examples of a combination of big data and survey, but doesn't involving having a pre-existing relationship with the company. So on the left-hand side, this is one size fits all. It's a study on context collapse on Facebook. So I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of this study, but this study utilizes a very unique data set called My Personality. And this data set is a combination of psychometrics as well as Facebook behavioral data. The data set was collected in an era when Facebook was before Cambridge Analytica. So somehow the researchers were able to collect it, and my research group were able to access that data set, which gave us an opportunity to test context collapse on an unprecedented scale behaviorally. The article on the right-hand side, audience size, moderator activity, gender, and content diversity on Twitch, This was Grace Wolf's dissertation project. So we worked together. We collected behavioral data via API at Twitch, but we also collected survey data, again, without any pre-existing relationship with Twitch, the company. So it can be done even, I mean, it would be great if you have a relationship with the company, but if you don't, there are still ways that you could combine big data and other smaller types of data. Another way of doing this is through big data plus experiment. So again, I want to show a few examples. This is actually an ongoing line of research. Indan Lu and Yilan Peng, two of my collaborators, and myself, we are working on visual features of digital images and videos and how they may impact credibility judgment. So the first published paper unpacking multimodal fact-checking features and engagement of fact-checking videos on Chinese TikTok, we did collect big data from Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok. And there are rampant misinformation, disinformation on those video sharing sites, and there are also fact-checking programs on video sites. TikTok in China has launched its fact-checking accounts to post fact-checking videos to debunk rumors, which are of interest in this study. So we collected fact-checking videos on Chinese TikTok, and then we did computational video analysis of all these videos plus human coding. Okay, so it's not all automated. Sometimes, the old tried and true human coding still works best. We also collected engagement data such as numbers of likes, comments, reshares, etc. And then we used the computational analysis of the visual features to group these videos into clusters. Okay, so this is an area I think urgently needs more theoretical guidance, because all these features of the video, such as brightness or color complexity, color dominance, face presence, etc., they are really nice to be calculated, and they can be done computationally. But how do you make sense of them in theoretical frameworks? So I do feel that we're not quite there yet. We have the computational tools, we are able to analyze them, but what do they really mean, in our research questions, right? So that's still kind of an open line of research that I'm still working on with my collaborators. So we collected visual features. We also collected non-visual features, and we did lots of human coding as well. So it's a hybrid analysis framework that combines computational analysis and human coding. And we found that these fact-checking videos on Douyin employ various attention eliciting strategies. We found 3 types of clusters. And then, this computational analysis sets us up for future experiment. Okay, so from the computational analysis of videos, we collected, all these prominent features and these clusters, and then we plan to use that, the results of the big data analysis, to feed into our subsequent experiment. And does this same line of thinking, combining big data and other smaller data sets, other traditional methods, is center in our current research project funded by the National Science Foundation, which is titled, Understanding How Visual Features of Misinformation Influence Credibility Perceptions. So I'll just quickly go through this. So in this study design, we have human-in-the-loop big data analysis, which is the ready-made part, but we're going to feed the results of the ready-made into our custom-made, the experiments. So again, I feel like this is an area where synergy will be created once we combine ready-made and custom-made. And as a way of illustration here, let's say we find that facial orientation and brightness are both salient visual features in our first stage computational analysis. then we can create these stimuli based on photos of Dr. Fauci, for example, right? These are mock-ups, simply for illustrative purposes. We were not actually using these same stimuli in our experiment, but this will give you an idea. Let's say facial orientation and brightness are important features from the computational analysis, then we can test them as is illustrated here in the mock-ups in our experiment, okay? So in such a setup, we are hoping to find out how the prominent visual features may generate different credibility perceptions and through which mechanisms. All right, so we talked about two future research directions. One is from text data to multimodal content. The other is combining ready-mades and custom-mades. The third and the last future direction I want to mention is to use big data as an integral component of the research workflow. And I'm a firm believer in that. And I think to some extent, we're already seeing this, especially with AI tools such as GPT, right? And this could require infrastructure building, curriculum development, etc. My vision is that big data will become a core literacy for students. It will be an important tool in our tool belt, just like basic statistical reasoning is a core literacy for students, and big data should be as well. So big data will be very useful in research topic identification, reviewing and summarizing existing work, in initial data collection, in setting up survey questions, in generating experimental stimuli, and generating prompts of qualitative interviews, and so on. And then, of course, in the actual data collection and analysis stage. Okay. So as I mentioned, I think we are already seeing kind of the beginning of people adopting big data as an integral component of the research workflow. And one example would be ChatGPT or large language models. So specifically for CSS research and teaching, I've asked ChatGPT a few things. For example, it can help us summarize and distill research papers. Not the most accurate, but for some of the papers I tried, it does an okay job. It could also generate experimental stimuli. And what else? And can be excellent teaching tools as well, right? So, I have tried to, use it generating code examples. So it is very intuitive and it adapts to the learner. So it could be a really excellent tool for teaching coding. I think, when we talk about GPT, plagiarism or like using AI, of course, is a very big concern. There's no question about it. But I also see huge potential for it to revolutionize how we can teach computational methods, to help us write. I'm happy to talk more about what I have observed, that, what my colleagues are doing with GPT, and also how I have used GPT and, similar tools in my own research workflow, okay? So just to wrap things up, sorry for going over time a little bit, I want to acknowledge all my brilliant students and collaborators, and of course, our funders as well, and happy to take questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for sharing the very insightful research and very interesting research that combines both big data and surveys, moving beyond the text data to multimodal data. And also, I think the last section about the future direction of CSS is also very inspiring and give us a lot of more behaviors we can do in the future to move beyond the current step. So now I want to open the floor to our participants to see if you have any questions.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So I have two questions that are unrelated. So the first question is related to the use of AI, and as researchers using AI to really get a feel for the body of work of our different fields. So you're an associate editor. What are your thoughts about opening up research to these large language models so that they could be used for that purpose? I think one of the weaknesses now with ChatGPT is that it doesn't have all of the, I think it goes up till September 2021. So it wouldn't have anything past that date. And I assume some publishing journals maybe wouldn't want their articles included in this large language model.
I don't hear the question that clearly. I think, did you ask about, as an editor, my views of using tools such as ChatGPT, in the research practice, and as editors, what kind of guidelines do we have? I'm sorry if I misunderstood your question.
No, that's correct. Should I go up there?
Yeah, I can't really hear that clearly. There's a little bit of echo.
No problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. So my question is, as an associate editor, what are your thoughts about opening up research to these large language models so that they could be included as we're using AI tools?
Okay, do you mean, using ChatGPT, in every step of research, including, collecting data, including help us, generate ideas or writing papers?
Yes. So for example, using ChatGPT as a way to get a feel for the whole body of work. So I think one of the weaknesses that all researchers have is that it's hard to really get a full grasp of your field because there's just so much information. But AI, I view as one tool that may help solve that problem. Yes,
I don't think I have a very good answer at this point. I think all the editors and reviewers and the researchers are struggling, but I can tell you, I think I've talked to a lot of scholars. Everybody is using GPT in some way. So at this point, whether they explicitly list GPT or other AI tools in author disclosure is not relevant anymore because everybody is using it in some way. But that doesn't actually answer the question. I think the academic community really has to come together and collectively think about, what behaviors are okay, what behaviors are not okay, and what behaviors have to be disclosed and why. So I think about these questions. I don't have a clear answer, but if you or anybody else in the audience have thoughts, I'm really happy to hear them.
Thank you. That's great to hear. And then my second question is just, can you speak more to how you went about establishing the relationships with these gaming companies?
Right. That's an excellent question. So I would have to say that I cheated by getting there really early. So I started working on my dissertation, I think around 2008. So I graduated with my PhD in 2010. At that time, there isn't a word to describe the data set I work with. So the word big data was not even mainstream. And the companies, they were sitting on these large troves of big data without realizing what the thing they can do with them. So at that time, they were much more willing to work with us, and in exchange for, I don't know, some consulting services or whatever, just as a goodwill to support the research community. But things have changed drastically in the last decade and a half. So right now, I think every large company, first, they are extremely, extremely cautious of releasing their big data for research or other purposes. Because, as you can see what happened to Facebook after Cambridge Analytica, this could be a publicity nightmare for these companies. Second, the companies will think of the big data as sort of a kind of engine of growth within their own unit. So that's why they are much more reluctant to kind of, share this engine of growth even with the research community. So things are very, very different now than when I was starting collaborating with those companies in late 2000s or, after 2010. But as I said, there are actually still ways you can get in. So for game companies, I think establishing trust is really, really important. And sometimes we have to kind of, take smaller steps, for example, getting their trust by becoming consultant. And then once you have, accumulated enough goodwill and enough credibility, it is much easier to make the ask then. I wouldn't recommend just cold calling companies, say, hey, I'm this researcher and why don't you give your, data set to me? And this would not work, unfortunately. And another thing I think a lot of computational scholars have been doing is to look for more kind of API type of access, like Twitter, like Instagram, like Facebook. So I talked a lot about that. So this is the lower hanging fruit, right? There are content data, but there are many ways to enrich the content data by, attaching an experiment or attach a survey to it to make it not just long and narrow, but also long and wide. So I feel that even without an establishing relationship with company, there are still things you can do. And then the third I would suggest is to explore secondary data sets. So one of the examples I showed later is the one size fits all, the context collapse paper was actually a result of a secondary data set. So, so the author of the data set, Michael Kosinski, he's now a professor at Stanford. So this data set, that's a very interesting long story, kind of predated Cambridge Analytica. And I think to some extent, it is the precursor of Cambridge Analytica, although Michael Kosinski had nothing to do with Cambridge Analytica. They were like part of the good guys. Anyway, so he gave a talk at UC Davis, I think it was in 2016 or something like that. And then he mentioned that they have built this data set of Facebook behavior as well as people's survey responses. Basically, they designed a Facebook third-party application. In this application, they asked people to fill in a bunch of psychological, psychometric questions. And then in the end, they said, would you mind donating your Facebook behavioral data for research purposes? And like some people said yes. And that's why they have collected this really very rare combination of behavior data and people's, psychometrics. And I said, can I have access? And he said, yes. So we collaborated, and then we were able to test something that the psychologists were not interested in, but what was very interesting for us, which is context collapse. So yes, so I think secondary data sets, and then, think about ways to augment content data, and then establishing relationship is difficult, but it is also doable.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, hi, Dr. Shen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, greeting from E and John from RUC. And I have two questions. The first one is regarding the connection between tracing data, or the so-called big data, and survey, because I myself do this connection as well. And I find if regardless of which way we go, like if we start from social media data and look for the participant to answer our survey, or the reverse, like we're asking people their social media accounts in the survey, regardless, we will have a really high attrition rate and sacrifice a lot of details. So I'm wondering, could you expand a little bit more on how do you improve the efficiency of connecting these two sides?
I don't have a recipe. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think that what you said is a very, very, very real threat. So I've been dealing with that too. And typically in surveys, people are very reluctant to even provide their handle. So I think that's what contributes to the high attrition rate. Another idea potentially could be useful is that to combine one big data with another big data. So I know some of my colleagues, they did this is to get Twitter data, Twitter profile, and then they match them with public voter records. Okay, so this is different from combining big data with survey, but combining big data with another big data source actually also, serve the same purpose, which is to make the data set wider. Yes, I completely get your concern. I don't have any secret recipe. In our Twitch study, actually, a lot of people were very reluctant. So we had a super high attrition rate as well. And we were not even looking at the Twitch broadcasters. We're asking people who they watch, right? it turns out a lot of people would just leave it as blank. So this gives us a lot of difficulty in trying to combine these two. So yes, once you have a very big data set and a smaller data set, the attrition rate will be very high. So I guess we just have to invest in the survey. You start with 10,000 people, even if you only have 5%, 10% of response rate, you still have something.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is regarding the multimodal studies, because I do notice that a lot of people are aware that we need to study more on videos and pictures and so on, but we do have a lot of barriers. I talked with Indan previously, and she said like she had several TB of TikTok videos that she hasn't really dig into. So I'm wondering like what are some other barriers except for like storage and stuff. And how should we
I think that's an excellent question. Something I've been struggling myself. And to be honest, even though we conquer all these technical barriers, the analysis, the results, a lot of time we cannot make sense of it. So this is what I talked about in the my collaboration with Indan, the Chinese TikTok paper. So what we found is that, you stick those into your program. Let's say you conquered all the technical barriers of downloading the data, and make sure, the Python scripts works or whatever. And it generates, let's say, 100 different visual features. But how do we even make sense of that? So I'm really struggling. We're all struggling at that point. That is, I see kind of two fundamental ways of analyzing multimodal data at this point. The first fundamental way is that scholars took multimodal data and then somehow they want to extract text from it. Okay, so the thinking is still very text oriented. So let's say I can grab all the YouTube videos as I want, but in the end, I'm going to take the transcripts of all these YouTube videos, and then I'm going to analyze the transcripts. Okay, so I think this is the right direction, but we're actually not using all this, video data. Instead, we kind of compress the video. We only take the text within the video. Is this better than pure text analysis? I think it is, but is it using the full spectrum of what this video gives us? Right? I think it doesn't. Okay, so that's the one kind of primary way I see when people are engaging multimodal data. The same with podcasts, right? How do you analyze podcasts? Typically, you get the transcript. That's most of the research I've seen as editor and as researcher is that. But what about the intonation? What about how people tell the story, how people say it, right? Like all that is lost in the compression and translation. And then the second approach is, I think, what our TikTok study represents is that we actually analyze the video, but we don't know how to make sense of it. Brightness, for example. I mean, is there a theoretical framework that tells me brightness will impact whatever dependent variable in some meaningful way? I mean, I do believe maybe brightness does have an effect, but it's probably in conjunction with other variables, right? So through what mechanism does brightness matter, okay? And brightness is just one example. There are many other things like complexity or entropy or color dominance or phase presence. I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg of the video features that are available to us, but we are significantly lacking in our theoretical development to make sense of the full spectrum of video and auditory features that are available to us. Okay, so to some extent, we're dragged along by technological development and accessibility, but in terms of theoretical thinking, we're not quite ready yet.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up question. So do you think there's another field or other disciplinary that we can borrow from? Because when I talk with people from English literature, they also have multimodal analysis, but it's kind of defined in another way. So do you think theoretically we have another field to borrow from?
I think yes, I think yes, we definitely should borrow from another field, but the translation process will be very time consuming too. So for example, when I discuss this with people from visual communication or visual rhetoric, there are actually people who are already looking at different visual features for these videos, and they're making sense of it beautifully. The problem is that it has to be done by an expert, and this process is not scalable at all. Okay, so when I read visual rhetoric and visual communication literature, I would say, yes, that's exactly what I want, but how do I connect their very detailed analysis of all these visual representations and the message and the argument? How do I translate that into my calculation of brightness and face presence and make it automate? I do find value in there, but I really can't scale up that analysis. And how, I'm also struggling with connecting that analysis with all these automated visual analysis.
Hi, Dr. Shen. Actually, I'm really interested in your first study regarding using multiplayer games as the context. But because I am also using multiplayer games to conduct my study, but one question I was usually faced with is that the reviewers ask me about the generalizability of my results, because they say that there might be systematic difference between the virtual world and the real world. So what's your opinion about this question?
That's a good question. I also get asked that a lot. I think I think this would this is how I would approach this. First of all, I would be careful in my claim. So many meaningful studies can be done that are looking at behavior in the virtual world only, and sometimes it doesn't have to generalize to the world that is not in the virtual world. So if your goal is not to generalize League of Legends to a real world, then that shouldn't be a problem. So I would be very, very careful and think very carefully about your research question. Is the goal to generalize that behavior in virtual world to some other world that have governed by different parameters? Okay. Now, let's say if your goal is indeed to generalize the behavior you found in the virtual world to some other world that has very different parameters, then I think you should establish that even though the parameters are different, this behavior that you're studying should not change. Okay. Am I making sense? So for example, if this is economic transactions, right? So economic transactions in the virtual world, and I actually had a paper on it, we found it's surprisingly extremely similar to the economic transactions in the real world. Now, the virtual world is different from the real world in many ways. But if we can establish that, the parameters governing economic transactions is the same, then generalizability shouldn't be a problem.
Thanks. Very insightful.
You're welcome.
Hello, Dr. Cindy. This is Narayani. So I'm here at CNM as a postdoctoral fellow. My research focuses on political polarization on online social platforms using agent-based models. My eyes just lit up when you mentioned agent-based models and a few slides, because I seem to be an exception in the group where most of them work with big data. My question to you is, agent-based models often have this downside that they need constant validation with real-world data. And they are not accepted in isolation for obvious reasons. So what according to you is the future of agent-based models? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer because I don't primarily use that, but I've read I've read a scholarship using agent-based modeling. Okay, so this is my kind of very immature or naive opinion. Okay, so coming from someone who doesn't do agent-based modeling as often, I feel that some of the criticisms, yes, I get that a lot from reviewers. Yes, it's not universally accepted. Now, to make it more acceptable, I think there are two things you can do. First is that, for agent-based modeling, you have parameters, right, in your model. If you could show the parameters actually come from empirical data. So that I think is a very good step to show how your model is rooted in empirical data, not something you built as a thought experiment. Okay. Second thing you can do is to take agent-based modeling results and then try to see if you can replicate that using empirical data. This is harder, but if you can demonstrate that, again, this could help you, preempt that argument that this is, could be a thought experiment, but not necessarily happens in the real world. So those are kind of two things I can think of. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Anyone have further questions?
I think that's all from our participants. So thank you so much. Great, give a round of applause for Dr. Shen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Great questions.
For your time. And we're looking forward to seeing you in Singapore.
Yes, hopefully in this August. Bye, everyone. Thank you.